When it comes to doodling, this is a really fun way to explore different subject matter and a great way to work on our observational skills. Cute little doodles can be something that we explore from our imagination, but the surrounding environment provides us with a great source of inspiration as well. With that being said, in today's tutorial, we will be looking at a few ways on how to approach doodle drawings, how to color them, and how to kind of create your own unique style. So with that being said, hey guys, my name is Matt. Welcome to another tutorial by artandcontext.org, where we explore various art-related topics. And in today's video, we will be breaking down the process of how to create unique doodles within our own style. So in this tutorial, we will be exploring how to create our own unique doodles. So having a variety of different materials, whether it's drawing or painting materials, is a good idea. And we also want to make sure we have various colors just to provide ourselves with more options as we integrate color into our doodle drawings. Now, the first thing we want to do is we want to start by figuring out what is our own unique style. Now, the intention is to always consider starting very simple. This way you can work slowly by defining very simple shapes, working with basic line work, and kind of exploring a medium you enjoy. Generally, starting with food items is a really good way to develop your style because we can really simplify food structures or the structure of various food items into very basic drawings. Now, foods generally have simple forms. For instance, if we could sketch a donut as a simple circular tube-like structure, we can also then start to think about keeping details to a minimum for more doodle-like quality. But as we get more comfortable, we'll find that the doodling process is really about minimizing details and trying to capture the form as realistic or the subject matter as realistic as possible through the use of the most minimalistic details possible. So with that being said, starting with food is a really good idea. You do want to think through various details present, so always see how you can define them through the least amount of detail. We also will find that foods provide us with an array of unique shapes to provide us with a good challenge in terms of representing simple forms or forms that differ from one another. But as we do so, the intention is to kind of work with items that we can draw quite quickly, that we are quite familiar with. So starting with food is a really good idea, and this does give you the opportunity to kind of challenge yourself with different shapes, but in doing so we will find that at least we are already familiar with these kinds of items. So for instance, we can draw all the ingredients seen on a burger, but we don't necessarily need to worry about defining them to a degree that is realistic. So this is where we don't necessarily need to worry about texture, or we simplify the qualities of texture through some simple line work, gestural lines. But as we start to kind of get more comfortable with representing basic structures and move into maybe more of a animal territory, maybe animals that are very simple, like a jellyfish for instance, or other items with very simple shapes that could be plant life, but in this case we are drawing a jellyfish. But as we kind of work with more unique textures, what we can do is incorporate something that is very unique to the doodling genre, and that is gestural line. Now, gestural lines are basically simple lines that can be described as a way of emphasizing the form of a structure or a subject. In the case of a jellyfish, as we have drawn here, we can have some wavy lines that basically run vertically through the mushroom or bell shape at the top of the animal. But in doing so, what we are basically establishing is a detail of a texture within that particular feature without necessarily drawing these details or textures in a realistic fashion. Now again, with the doodling genre, the intention is to minimize these details to a degree where we can see the subject matter represented in a way that we can identify it without necessarily looking too realistic. So the intention here is to kind of play around with simple items, maybe food items, maybe simple animal shapes, as well as basic man-made items, maybe like canned cool drinks or very simple shapes, just to get a sense of the actual medium you like, this type of detailing you like to add in terms of what kind of line work you use, what kind of gestural lines, or how to utilize gestural lines, and how to basically represent textures of different forms. Now, gestural lines can be curvy lines to represent more bumpy-like textures, they can be dots, or they can be these straight lines to represent a more sheen-like quality or plush surface on an actual material. But as you get more comfortable, the intention is to start exploring items that maybe are a little bit unique in shape and more challenging, and this is where we start to kind of really put together all the unique ways of our own doodling style into practice to represent more unique items. Now again, think through the concept of simplifying the main features. This is where we think about maybe line thickness, surface or how to integrate details with these gestural line works, but the intention is to always represent the item in a way that makes sense without necessarily doing so to a degree where the item looks too realistic. Now, naturally, it all is a matter of getting comfortable with our own style, our own type of medium, thicker lines, thinner lines, but something to bear in mind is that gestural lines are a way of representing textures through the least amounts of detail possible. So for instance, this is where straight lines could be used to represent smooth or plush surfaces, maybe very good for metallic surfaces, or wavy lines or scattered lines can be used to represent more rough textures, maybe something that is more matte in texture or something that has a little bit more of a bumpy surface. So really think about how to basically use gestural lines to represent details in the most basic or the most minimal way as possible. Now, some things to think about is with structures that have symmetry, in the case, let's say, of a butterfly, we don't necessarily have to make the features perfect, but we can use imperfect qualities to represent the cartoon likeness of the doodle. Now, another thing to think about is doodles can shift into more realistic territory, and they can shift into more cartoon-like, very unrealistic territory where there are degrees of representation in terms of how realistic the subject matter looks. Now, you can also start to explore some simple aspects of three-dimensionality in the case, let's say, of something like a cylindrical vase, where once again we are slowly building up to more complex items whilst understanding what kind of style we are basically developing for ourselves through the experimentation of these various concepts that we are breaking down. Now, something that we basically can start to look at is how to explore the more unique type of textures. So texture is a unique aspect of doodling because, once again, we don't necessarily need to worry about too much detail, but at the same time, we want to make sure that we are representing the item in a way that is identifiable. So naturally, the main shape of, let's say, something like a fish will define the fish as a fish. So we'll know that we are drawing a fish. However, we can then take the doodle further by integrating, as aforementioned, these gestural lines that basically define various features. So this is where we start to think about the features of the fish, the scales, the gills, the dorsal fins, the back fins, and various other features, and how to represent them in a way where the gestural lines define them in a sense that does actually look adequate on a fish without basically defining them to a degree where it looks too realistic. And that is purely an aesthetic quality. So this is where we can play around with these gestural marks, where basically we are defining these features, and this is where we can maybe consider using lines, spots, blobs, or anything really to kind of capture the essence of the shape. Let's say lines for a fin-like shape because there's a lot of linear structure in dorsal fins and so on, and maybe blobs for something like scales on a fish because scales tend to be more rounded and more scattered throughout the body. Now, as we play around with these various types of mark making styles for our own doodling drawings, we can start to really emphasize qualities that are very unique by these various gestural lines, and we'll start to see how different types of gestural marks can be more effective in representing certain types of structures. So for instance, with the fish, we can also emphasize, let's say, the fins with these types of lines that define the skeletal structure that run through the shape of the various fins, and we can do that very simplistically. But the idea is to really kind of get comfortable with drawing things very quickly and not necessarily worrying too much on how much time you spend on a drawing. Now, naturally, as we progress, we will also find that there is differences in textural qualities between organic and mechanical structures or man-made structures. Now, with something like metallic structures or man-made structures, our lines will be slightly more rigid and smooth when we define the surface areas of these kinds of objects. So this is the same for gestural lines within the doodle, which can emphasize the mechanical form. So that's where we really want to consider the difference between something that is a little bit more texturally rough in the case of, let's say, like scales on a fish, compared to something like smooth, like the top surface area of a television set. With more unique items like transparency, we can consider utilizing some shading to emphasize a glossy surface, and this is where tonal variation becomes a very unique tool for emphasizing these qualities. By using these very light washes of tonal variation, we can basically have details present behind these tonal additions or these moments of shading, and this will kind of emphasize the transparent quality within a doodle whilst maintaining these lines that really emphasize the shape of the structure, and that is maybe good for things like bottles, medicine bottles, glasses, and so on. Now, as we get more familiar with the kinds of mediums we are using, whether it is pens, paintbrushes, pencils, or any other item, it is important to remember that doodles are never intended to be a realistic representation of the subject that we are drawing. So there is a quality of embracing inconsistencies as an actual stylistic choice. And this can have a great visual quality within your doodles because it looks a little bit more playful, a little bit more cartoony, and a little bit more scribbled and scattered. Now this allows us to also just play a little bit with the character aspects of subject matter, making them a little more funny, goofy, or silly in various ways. And this is especially true for character-like subjects such as animals, people, limbs, or anything that we associate with a character or having a little bit of personality. So warping the form and the structure can add a lot of quirky aspects to a character doodle. Now as we start to embrace these inconsistencies and simplify details, we can create doodles that represent various structures in their most simplified form or cartoon-like variations. But as we continue with the sketching process, try to have as much variety in your doodles as possible, exploring various surfaces, shapes, and forms. Consider doing doodles that maybe look a little bit more realistic in terms of representation, and then some that are very simplified. At this point, moving between organic structures and mechanical structures should be a little bit more seamless because the intentions are the same with both. Now the intention being that we are looking to simplify for one, allow for inconsistencies, number two, and work with these gestural lines, these basically simplified details to represent various subjects in their more doodle-like or cartoon-like quality. Now the next thing we want to explore is basically adding color to our doodles. Now we can start to think about the color values that we would otherwise see in certain subjects, which can be a great starting point to fill in certain doodles. So this is where we consider blues and grays obviously for more mechanical structures, and then maybe greens and yellows for maybe plant life, maybe food items, basically associating the more accurate color palette that we see in real life to the doodles that we create. Now with plant life, for instance, we can go in another direction and utilize various tonal values of greens and browns, and the idea is to also work with various tonal values of a certain color to create a little bit more dimensionality within them to give your drawings or your doodles a more nuanced quality. So basically when we consider color, it's where we start to think about three-dimensional aspects of structures. So basically with color, this is where we think about how darker values of a certain color can represent shadows and vice versa for its highlighted qualities. Now with certain subjects, we can be playful with the use of our colors. It's really about the aesthetics you intend to achieve as well. And this is where we consider slightly more muted colors, maybe if we want to go in that direction, or more vivid colors for maybe a different kind of direction. However, there is no necessarily specific choice in terms of how we color doodles. This is also a matter of exploration, but thinking about tonal variation is a great kind of detail within the coloring aspect of doodles that can really amplify the quality of the doodle and give it a little bit more of a three-dimensional quality. Another really useful tip for beginners with color is to start by using softer values of color and then slowly build up your colors. This way you have more control over the coloring process. So you always start with lighter colors and then work your way into darker colors through a layering process. For instance, we can work with blacks and grays for, let's say, something like a pistol. Now when we think about a pistol, obviously naturally we think that it is gray or maybe darker in color, so we can build up these lighter tonal values of grays and then slowly work in the darker alternative of a gray, which would be a black color, slowly layering on top of those lighter grays to bring more shape to the various features, let's say the handles or to the ridges in the barrel of the gun. Now the same concept can be applied to colors for more organic structures. So for instance, if we are creating something like a mushroom and we are working with these reds, we can use the darker alternative of a red, which would be brown, to represent the shadows, and this maintains a color consistency as we represent shadow formations in these various structures. But again, build up your experience with colors, and the more experience you get, naturally you'll become more comfortable with creating these very unique colorations in subject matter that is quite unique. Now, lastly, we're going to look at concepts of highlights and darker lines for details. So lastly, one major detail to emphasize form is to work with darker lines, and this is where we really represent the outline or enhance the outline and add in highlights to play around with surface areas once again. Now, utilizing whites and blacks over colors in a doodle can make the doodle stand out a little bit more significantly and enhance its tonal variations within the highlights along its various surface areas. Now again, this is basically always a last step that should not necessarily take too much time, and it is a matter of working with the already established doodle with its shape, its type of line work, its shading, its colors. But this is where we strategically maybe want to enhance an outline, or maybe add in white highlights to areas that are illuminated or exposed to a light source, to create that variation between shadowed and highlighted areas, and ultimately a way to enhance the overall quality of your doodle that you have drawn. Now, we have looked at a few different things. We've looked at how to kind of explore different mark making styles, considering medium, considering gestural lines, how to also utilize these different types of marks or gestural lines to represent different surfaces, and then ultimately how to kind of think about a way to integrate color through either singular types of layers, or playing around with tonal variation to create slightly more dimension within the structure of your various subject matter, and then ultimately, as a last resort, adding in some darker detailing with some darker line work and some highlights to really emphasize the overall quality of your doodle. But otherwise, that is it on how to approach doodles, some key concepts to think through, giving you a kind of a brief understanding of how to approach doodle drawing, how to think about it, maybe drawing from your imagination or from life. And that is it for today. If you did like this video, please like and subscribe, and let us know in the comment section what you would like from us to create in terms of content. We'd love to hear back from you guys, but please do make sure you like and subscribe. That helps to grow the channel, which ultimately enables us to make more art related content for you guys, which we love to share. But that is it from me today. Until next time, see you in the next video. Cheers.